Okay, so welcome back. I'm sorry for the hiatus. Tonight, like we do every night, we're going to start with the gospel from this weekend and then do a brief reflection on that. So the gospel this weekend is taken from Mark, and that's kind of important given our subject tonight is the Gospel of Mark. So, and it's the first 8 verses of Mark. So Mark chapter 1, verses 1 to 8. So you're welcome to haul out your Bible and follow along. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, "See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way, the voice of the one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." John, the baptizer, appeared in the wilderness, proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And people from the whole Judean countryside and all the people of Jerusalem were going out to him and were baptized by him in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. Now John was clothed with camel's hair, with a leather belt around his waist, and he ate locusts and wild honey. He proclaimed, "The one who is more powerful than I is coming after me. I am not worthy to stoop down and untie the thong of his sandals. I have baptized you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit." So that's our reading tonight. At least that's the gospel. It's one of 4 readings if we include the psalm. And again, if we go back to our original questions, what does it say about God? Well, it says right in the beginning, God has a son. Right? In fact, that's one of the features we'll talk about tonight in the Gospel of Mark. So he's called the Son of God. Mark comes out right from the beginning and says, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's how he opens his gospel, the first verse. I'm here to tell you about this guy. And then the rest of it tells us about the relationship really between Jesus and John the Baptist. If you know who John the Baptist was? So, most people don't. John the Baptist is the last great prophet of the Old Testament from a Christian perspective. So there's Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Nathan, and there's dozens and dozens of prophets. The one who closes the book on the Old Testament is John the Baptist. And we know at his time, so he's a few months older than Jesus Christ, he started a ministry. And like a good Jewish prophet, he called people out for their bad behavior. Forgive me, sometimes I use other words to describe bad behavior. But he called people out and said, listen, fix your ways or it's going to get worse. Right? Sound familiar? We're getting that right now from our politicians involving COVID, right? We hear that all the time. Sometimes they kind of scold us for, but there's a truth to that, right? So Israel had always had a sense of itself. Remember earlier on when we talked about salvation history a bit, that when things were good, it was because they were behaving well and God was blessing them. And when things were bad, it wasn't because God had written them off. It's because they had rejected God. And there was evidence in the centuries before Jesus Christ, that the Jewish society kind of fell apart. They had a bunch of kings that we would call them despotic. They were terrible, self-serving. They weren't the stuff of kings. There wasn't any nobility in them anymore. So along comes John, and he calls out the people for this. He says, you got to stop doing these things. This is not the way things are. This is not what it means to be a Jew. And then couched in that, because he had a following of thousands of people, not dozens. I mean, remember Jesus had 12 disciples? John had thousands of people. And they came to be baptized, which was a ritual washing for them. I'm no longer going to be this person. I'm going to be a different kind of person. So that says a lot about the relationship between John and Jesus. And then what does it say about us, right? You ever get your hands so dirty you can't wash them? And then you wash again, and you wash again, and you wash again, you realize, I can't get this off of me. Right? Sometimes that happens to us physically, but it often happens to us morally and spiritually as well. And John's message is, so much as don't worry about this, because as much as I'm orienting you in the right direction, your leader is about to come, and he's much greater than I am. So we know that in what we call then the Jesus movement, or the early Christian church, which was sometimes called the Way, right? So in the period of Jesus' life till about all the time we started writing the Gospels, or even later, it was called the Way. We weren't called Christians yet. Most of us, the world saw Christians as a sect of Judaism. But then Greeks came in en masse, and they're not really behaving like Jews. What are these people? Well, they're actually followers of Jesus Christ. This is something entirely new. So Mark's giving us an indication of how that happened. And a lot of the people who came to follow Jesus Christ were people who had initially followed John. And they had questions about that. Is John the Messiah? No. And he says it himself. I'm not the guy. But he's coming. I know him. And we'll hear a story in a couple of weeks about just how well he knew who Jesus was even before he was born. So those are kind of the questions we have, okay? Now tonight we're going to take a look at the Gospel of Mark. We're going to take a look at the Gospel of Mark because last week we started a new season of effectively a new church year, the second church year, so we work on a 3-year cycle, and this year is dedicated to the Gospel of Mark. And the analogy I often use is this. Have you ever gone on a great adventure? Like what? There you go. Yeah, right, so I'm a kind of an adventure seeker. And to use a quote from a really important friend of mine, he gave me this years ago, and I quote him all the time. You know the difference between an adventure and a vacation? A vacation you go on with your wife and kids, an adventure you might not come back from. So when we were soldiers, we used to, this is going to be a great adventure. Every time we went off to some place that was really dangerous, on some level we're all, yeah, this is going to be a good adventure. It's time for an adventure. That's right. Absolutely. So, but if you think about a great adventure or even a great vacation, there's sort of 4 seasons to a great adventure. First, you conceive of it. As wild as it is in your mind or in your heart, you get this crazy idea you want to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. You know what that is? It's in Africa. I only say that because that's one of my bucket list items. I always wanted to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. I don't know where I picked that up. And one day I'll do it. God willing, and COVID restrictions or whatever, we start to travel again. I'm going to figure out a way to climb it, Anyway, the point is, we have a moment of conception, right? And we start to dream about this and we get excited. We think, okay, now we got to make it happen. And in the ordinariness of making a real adventure happen, there's things we have to do. We have to save, and we have to buy plane tickets and get passports, and and figure out the logistics just to get to where it is we're going. Now, sometimes the adventure begins in the journey, right? And in the Gospels and with Jesus Christ, it is in the journey. For us, usually, if you're going to a beach vacation in Mexico, the plane ride there is just a terrible, boring experience. It's not fun. You're herded like cattle and zapped and prodded and radiated and stamped, and you stand in line. You pay. Air travel's not that much fun anymore. But a great adventure often includes the trip itself, right? And we call that ordinary time, right? It's a great adventure. We're on the journey. Let's go find this place, right? And then we hit the high point. We get to the point of the adventure. And the point of the adventure in the liturgical year, which is what we talked about last time, is Lent, Holy Week, and Easter. That's when we imagine yourself standing at Lent is standing at the foot of Mount Kilimanjaro. It's like, holy cow, that's a long way up. And we begin the work of climbing. Away we go. And we climb and climb and climb. And all along, we want to give up. Like if you've ever done something really difficult like that, and I've done lots of times where I've had adventures in canoes and otherwise hikes, it'd just be easier to turn around and quit. But then there comes a point where you're now committed. It's shorter to get to where you're going than it is to turn around and go back, right? We're in this for the long haul now. In some ways, that's a bit like Holy Week, because we can see the summit, but we're not quite there yet. And then we get to the summit, we stand there for a while, and oh my God, this is the most, I should have done this years ago, right? And that's a bit the Christian experience too. That's how we become Christian, right? You made the decision to come here to journey. You're in ordinary time now. You're kind of conceiving of what it means to be a Christian. At some point, it's going to become a long journey to get there. It's going to seem like a long journey, and all of a sudden, you're going to be standing on the top of the mountain. You're a very different person, right? And that's the point of a great adventure, is that it changes us as people. Absolutely does. Then, of course, we come back down the mountain, and then we enter into ordinary time, and then Advent comes along the next year, and we reconceive it. The way the Church, the Roman Catholic Church, uses its Gospels, right? These extraordinary gifts from these four men who wrote these stories for us: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The way we use them is, imagine that in this year, Mark is your adventure guide. He's going to tell you the story. And next year, Luke will tell us a story. And the year after that, Matthew will tell us a story. And all along in the story, we're going to encounter bits and pieces of others. Sometimes Mark will pipe, or Matthew will pipe up, and Luke will pipe up. But our tour guide is Mark. So that's why, in a good year, you sit down, you want to get to know this guy who's going to take you on a great adventure to Jesus Christ. And he starts his gospel with John the Baptist. That tells us something really important about where Mark is. So, who is Mark? If you could find in your Bible, if you turn to Acts 12:12, right? So that's the book right after Luke, right after John. So the historical book, the church book. In Acts 12, chapter 12, verse 12, it says this: as soon as he realized this, we're talking about Peter, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many had gathered and were praying. So this is a story about Peter and the name John, whose other name is Mark. Almost from the earliest antiquity, from the beginning of time, since the early church, we've always associated the evangelist Mark with this particular Mark. And in Acts 15:36-41, we have another encounter with another man they called him John, or John whom they called Mark. We'll find that again in Acts 15. And then in 1 Peter, so the letter of St. Peter. This is even more important. In 1 Peter, so right at the end towards the end of the New Testament, you'll find in chapter 5, verse 13, through Silvanus, whom I consider a faithful brother, so that's one of the followers of Peter. This is Peter speaking here. I've written this short letter to encourage you to testify that this is the true grace of God. Stand fast in it. So he's encouraging his followers to be faithful. Don't change your minds. You're on the right path. Trust me. I'm on the same path with you. Right? Stick to it. Your sister church in Babylon, that's one of the churches they founded, chosen together with you, sends you greetings, and so does my son, Mark. So Peter calls him my son. Remember, our first reading is Jesus Christ, Son of God. We should dwell a little bit on what that word means. Right? Most of us, we think of the word son, immediately we think of children. I'm the son of my father Peter. Matthew and Simon are the sons of me. So we think in terms of literal heritage, right? They're my progeny, right? If they were standing here next to you, they look like me. It'd be pretty obvious. Holy cow, you guys all look the same. But obviously the word son applies to more than that, right? When we construct in our heads, and we've talked about this before, what it means to say Jesus Christ, Son of God, that's an even deeper, more eternal sonship than the one I enjoy from my Father. Right? That's a sonship that pre-existed creation itself. That's a sonship that set the conditions for all of existence. That's an even deeper understanding of the notion of what it means to be a son. In this context, Peter's not talking literally about his boy. He's talking about one whom he brought to Jesus Christ. Right? So the church, again, when we talk about what the church is, one of the most powerful understandings of the church is that the church is a family. We call our priests fathers. Right? We're all sons and daughters in Jesus Christ. We see each other, not metaphorically, but literally as sons and daughters. That's the language we speak. So when Peter says, my son Mark, this is somebody he baptized. So what that tells us is that the Gospel of Mark is rooted in what Peter gave to this man. So that's it. So Peter, the first apostle, evangelizes, presumably baptizes, or has someone else do it, brings this man into the full life of faith, and this guy becomes a disciple of him, who goes on to found churches. And he writes what is probably the first of the 4 great gospels in the Bible, right? I say the first of the 4 great gospels. There are other gospels. I don't know if you knew that. The Bible contains 4 of them, and there's a whole bunch of other ones that sometimes conspiracy theorists say all kinds of stupid things about it. The point of the other gospels is they don't tell us anything else. Right? Eventually, if you watch the news on one channel, read it in one newspaper, found it on the internet, and listened to it on the radio, eventually you got the story, right? So why would I'm done with that story, right? So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, our ancestors agreed to very early on, told us the whole story. Everything else is they're either rehashing the same data, or what they're telling us is something more ridiculous about themselves than they are about Jesus, right? So we believe that the evangelist Mark wrote his gospel sometime while he was in Rome after Peter arrived in Rome. So the gospel is written in Greek, which means it's written to a Greek-speaking audience in Rome. So these aren't Jews anymore. So the church it's not just a Jewish sect anymore. It's us. It's our ancestors, right? We were the pagans. Most of us, our heritage is not Jewish, right? So he'd gone to a point where he's talking to, and this evangelist, who's one of them, begins to become an evangelist himself. The date of the writing of the gospel itself, we don't know. There's no dating on it. He didn't write, June 24th, 80. He didn't do that. And that wouldn't have been common in his time. But we can date it from the document itself. So there are a couple of historical events that we would say bracket the dates. One of them is that unlike Matthew and Luke, and Matthew, Luke, and Mark are very similar. Matthew and Luke talk about a very particular persecution, and they're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Mark doesn't do that. That tells us that in all probability it hadn't happened yet. So sometime before 70 AD he penned this. But he does talk about, is a persecution that happened in Rome. And that's the persecution. So in the summer of AD 64, there was a massive fire that burned a huge percentage of Rome, and the Christians were blamed for it. Nero blamed them. The Emperor Nero played his fiddle as Rome burned to the ground. That's history. That's not just a cartoon in Bugs Bunny, right? If you're a fan of Bugs Bunny, that's how I got to know the Emperor Nero, was through Bugs Bunny. But the point is that in AD 64 there was general persecution. That's also when we believe that Peter was killed. So Peter was martyred as a direct result of that. So if you think about it then, if the man who brought the faith of Jesus Christ to you, the story of the resurrection, the promise of baptism and eternal life, it reoriented your guide, right? Like your great adventure guide, was murdered now. And you flee, right? Like everyone else who would reasonably do that. At some point, you're going to say, I better write down what he told me, right? If you haven't already started, right? So that probably the impetus to do that. We know that about 4 years later, in AD 64, in fact, his date we can actually trace specifically. Mark was murdered in Alexandria. So 4 years later. So sometime between AD 64 and AD 68, he wrote this gospel. Okay? Which happens to be one of the greatest books in history. One of the most influential books in the whole of human history. This man wrote 16 chapters. So, if we look, for example, and the evidence we talk about AD 64 is in Mark chapter 10. It's hidden in there. Verses 17 to 31 is the parable of the rich man. And what he says is, starting at verse 30, who will not receive 100-fold now in this stage, houses, brothers, sisters, mothers, and children, and fields, with persecutions. That's important. When he says with persecutions, he's writing to an audience who has no delusion about what it means to follow Jesus Christ. I told you this was going to happen. It's happening, right? I warned you about the end of time. I don't know, you can say that. I always joke, none of us know when the end of time is coming, but I can guarantee yours is, right? So he's very pragmatic about this. So in all probability, that line is derived from a very real and lived experience where he watches the apostle who brought him to Jesus Christ get murdered. Okay? So he feared that the gospel might be lost, and then he would eventually take this on, and he did. He took it on to others. So let's look at some of the main features of this gospel. Okay, one of which we've already discovered. The opening line, one of the striking features about Mark's gospel is the use of the title, Son of God. Okay? For Jesus Christ, and we already saw this in our like I said, in our reading today, we learned it in the creeds, we've heard it elsewhere, but the title Son of God is sort of foundational. When he speaks of Jesus Christ, so when it's the evangelist speaking, he calls him the Son of God. All the time. It's written into it. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is depicted as someone otherworldly powerful. It really is in his character. If you think of him as a writer, Jesus is always in a hurry. He always uses the term, and immediately he did this. He's a man on a mission. He doesn't, well, then he thought about it, lingered, and consulted with his friends. That's not the Jesus of Mark's gospel. That's not the Jesus of the other gospels, by the way. But in Mark's gospel, there's a sense of urgency in what Jesus is doing. And think about it. He's the Savior of the world. He had about 3 years to do his ministry, set in place the whole of Christianity, set the conditions for followers. He did not have a lot of time to spare. So if you think your life is busy, take a look at his. And even in the stories, other gospels will give us a sense that he has a sense of leisure. But in Mark's gospel, he's busy. Immediately he goes and does this, and then he goes and does that. And what he's typically doing in Mark's gospel, and we're going to be invited to read the whole thing this week, he's doing acts of power. He's going from one amazing miracle to another, to another, to another, to another, to another. And what that's conveying to us is that he is in fact God. So the idea that God created the world in 6 days and then rested and never started to work again, that's not the image that Mark is telling us about God. And it's certainly not the image that Mark is telling us about his son. Okay? So, and we find examples of that. There's a lot in the name, right? When the high priest asks him at his death, just before, not his death, as he's being persecuted, in Mark 14, you say he's quiet, doesn't answer. And again, the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said to him, "I am." That's the line that gets him crucified, right? Are you Son of God? Yes. There's no ambiguity in that answer. Well, how do you feel about that? Jesus is unambiguous in Mark. One of the things I love about the story of Mark is that you get a very clear image of the man you're walking with. Right? There's nothing mediocre about the Jesus in Mark. There isn't in the other Gospels, but we're not inclined to interpret that way. This he's heroic, determined, and he knows what he's doing. He's saving lives. Right? Second feature of Mark's Gospel. And it's really striking. It's actually quite important. Mark's Gospel is the shortest. It's 16 chapters long compared to 28 of the others. So, Luke will take you about 2.5 hours to read, Matthew about the same. And Mark will take you about an hour and a half. Right? If you sat down, remember we're invited to do that this week, that's our homework. Sit down and read it cover to cover. It's better than anything you're going to get on Netflix anyway. By now we're all sick of Amazon Prime and television's always been boring. So take an hour and a half on Sunday and read the whole thing. And it's an amazing story of power. Imagine yourself walking with Jesus. It really is quite remarkable. But one of the things that's striking about it, especially in this Advent season, is, and we got that today, Mark 1, Mark starts the story of Jesus Christ with John the Baptist as an adult. In other words, unlike, the infants, the birth stories, where was Jesus born? He was born in Bethlehem. Everyone knows that. We don't know it from Mark. Mark never wrote that down. We know it because of Luke, and we know it because of Matthew. We don't know it because of Mark. So Mark never told the story of his childhood, which you'd think, well, that's kind of important. Why did you overlook this? And it gets a little more complicated if you look at the end of Mark's Gospel. So you turn to chapter 16. Depending on the version of the Bible you have, and this is important. At 16:9, so chapter 16, verse 9, you're going to find a little bracketed comment that says, a shorter ending. You may not see that. Do you see that? So it depends on, depending on the version of the Bible you have and how honest it is to the original manuscripts. In other words, there you go. It says the earliest manuscripts do not have the following verses of Mark, right? So the earliest tradition of Mark, the stuff, when we look through archaeology, the gospel ends at 16:9. And then 16:10 comes along, and what happens at 16:10? It goes on to tell the story of the resurrection. That meant the original, in some form or another, didn't have an account of the resurrection. You think, well, that's important. Right? Like the real reason, you think about it, the lens through which we became Christian isn't because this guy was powerful and taught great things. We'd had those kind of people before. Right? He's not just another prophet. He rose from the dead. He's the only one. And Mark, at least it appears in the earliest manuscripts, it's not there. Now there's some explanations to that. It is possible that Mark didn't have the time. Imagine him in Alexandria penning this as the hordes are coming to get him. And Mark was hanged and dragged through the city with a noose around his neck. The pagans hated him for what he was doing. He knew they were coming. So you try to imagine the urgency with which he's writing this to his brothers and sisters. Okay, guys. Like he's moving, right? I got to tell this story now. So I think it's one of the likely reasons why there isn't an infancy narrative, which you probably knew, and there isn't a story of the resurrection because everybody knew that, right? We wouldn't be here if we didn't rise from the dead. So I'm going to tell you the rest of the story, okay? We're believers in the resurrection and the life. So that's one explanation. The other explanation is that those manuscripts were destroyed in part. If you were the authorities in Alexandria or elsewhere trying to stamp out Christianity, and by this point they clearly were, you destroy its stuff. One of the things you destroy is any account that this guy rose from the dead, because that seems to be it's getting everybody's attention. Oh my God, he's God. Yeah. Yeah, so at some point we found them in later manuscripts. So the earliest manuscripts, I don't want to be misquoted here, but it seems to me they're early in the 2nd century. They don't have them, but by the time the 3rd century arrives, or the 4th century arrives, we start assembling the Bible, they're clearly there. So in Mark's gospel, those extra verses are really important. They talk about the resurrection. But there's a message in that too, and it's a challenging thing. We can't look at the cross. We can't, as Christians, we don't look at the horror of Holy Friday, of Good Friday, as somehow it's simply vindicated on Sunday. Every aspect of Jesus' life lends us to understanding the whole of who Jesus is. So we don't divorce the resurrection from the murder of Jesus. But at the same time, when we hold we're invited into a relationship with Jesus, we hold all of this together. So I don't know why Mark, the earliest ones, don't have. And I've never heard an answer convincing so much as to lay that stake on it, and I don't think anyone expects you to. But you will find that as one of the features of Mark's gospel, and it's unique to Mark's gospel. Absolutely unique. We do know he was murdered in AD 68, though. So my suspicion is he probably didn't have the time. Third great feature of the Gospel of Mark, and probably, I dare say, the most important, is Mark does a particularly spectacular job of creating an understanding of Jesus as what we call the suffering servant. So I already said he's, from the beginning, the first verse of the Bible, first verse of the Gospel rather, he's the commanding presence of the Son of God. He is the all-powerful, the one, the creator of the universe. He's everything. And he suffers more than you and I ever will. And that's a bit paradoxical. We think, that doesn't make any sense. Why? Think about it. If you had all the power in the world, would you choose to suffer? No. Most of us, we wouldn't do that. Right? If I had all the power, you ever seen Bruce Almighty? You ever watched the movie Bruce Almighty? He's clearly not the Almighty, right? Because he's highly self-serving. But what that tells us is that in Jesus Christ, what is also not present is any notion of selfishness. In other words, no sinfulness. So if you think about it, even in our day-to-day, have you heard the term COVID shaming? Okay. We have an incredible capacity as human beings to make scapegoats of others. We do this politically. We do this in sports. We do this racially. We do this in our genders. Men and women do this to each other. We do this in every way that we can conceive of being divisible. We do this. I'm better than them. They're weaker than me. They're the cause of all this problem. We call it scapegoating. And anthropologists and historians will tell us we've been doing this forever. And usually it seems fairly benign, and then all of a sudden something like the Nazi Holocaust comes along and we all get a sober second thought about just how bad this is. Right? Every culture does this. So a God that's all powerful wants to end the misery of human suffering and set new conditions, end the darkest parts of our sinfulness. Right? And the church, Mark's church, is being persecuted. He got killed for this. Well, he tells us the story of an all-powerful God who chooses to suffer so the rest of us don't anymore. And even if we suffer in this world, we won't in the next. And that's the message. Right? So Jesus is a suffering servant, a powerful, powerful image. And I would argue today, with all our rights and freedoms and all the chaos around us and all the struggles that we think we have because of the pandemic and the economy and wars all over the world, Mark's gospel is particularly germane. As a husband and a wife, as parents, you should pay attention to Mark. Part of being a parent is sometimes you suffer immensely through no fault of your own. And sometimes through no fault of your kids either. It's just the way the world is. You learn to take on these things. So in a world that denies suffering, it denies something of itself. It is what it is. And I've said this many times, that I would rather be the scapegoat than the one imposing it upon someone else. Right? I'd rather be the one hated than the hater. Right? History will prove that well, and the reason I say that is because the suffering servant of Jesus Christ in Mark's gospel hates no one. Even the men who are going to kill him, he doesn't hate them. There's no evidence he hates them. His capacity for them. So if our journey as Christians is to become Christ-like and we pay attention to Jesus of Mark's gospel, that's going to erode our hatred of others pretty quickly. And we're going to identify with those who suffer and then choose to suffer in grace. We say that. So, as a last point of reflection, and I'm going to end on this note, it's one of the great moments in Mark's gospel. According to Mark, we'll conclude where we started. The notion of the Son of God. And I used to do this all the time. So, years ago when I was an army chaplain, soldiers would come to me and say, can I have a Bible? We had these little Canadian Bible Society produced these little Bibles, and they were kind of cool because they matched our uniforms. They were, the little, So soldiers take 3 or 4 of them and give them to their little brothers and sisters and stuff like that, or whatever. And I'd always ask them the same question: are you going to read this thing? That was usually the answer. But every once in a while there'd be that one bright one, like 1 in 10. You say, "Oh yeah, really? Huh? Oh, now you've got my attention." And I take that one out of his hands, and I go to the shelf and I get a better one because the writing in there was about so big. So they were young; they could probably read it. But you can have that one too. But I'm going to give you a better version, bigger print. I said, the second question I asked him is, "How are you going to read this?" "Oh, I'll start beginning and finish at the end." And we've already talked about this. That's no way to read the Bible. No, you'll get to Leviticus and quit, and that would be terrible. Because the good news is hundreds of pages later. No. I'm going to take you to the high point. And this adventure, we're going to stand on the mountain first, then we're going to look down on everything else, okay? I'd say, well, what you really should do is read one of the Gospels. And to soldiers, I tell them this often. I say, which one? They'd ask. I say, always read Mark. They say, why? 2 reasons. It's the shortest, so you're more likely to read it. But more importantly, you're going to get accounted for those of us who are soldiers and who know what immense suffering is, and who have to confront suffering every day. You're going to find a Jesus in this gospel that speaks to the deepest parts of who you think you are as a man or as a woman. It's going to challenge you in very specific ways. So if you take the hour and a half it takes to read this thing tonight or tomorrow or sometime this week, you'll come back and you'll talk to me. I know you will. You won't be satisfied. I said, and dozens of them did that. It changed their lives. Right? That's how important this gospel is. All the gospels are important, but that's how important this one is, especially that audience. I think it's very important today. In the Gospel of Mark, and I'll end on this point, there are really 5 people who call Jesus the Son of God. Mark does, all the time. Many times. Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Like, all the time he says that. But he's the narrator of the story. Of those who speak in the story, those who say he's the Son of God, you know who they are? God says he is. That's an important feature. This is my son with whom I'm well pleased. It blew me. Okay, we're listening now. You got my attention. So God says this publicly. Second are the demons. His enemy knows. See, that's one of the features of Mark's gospel, is that every time Jesus immediately goes and heals someone, what he's really confronting isn't a disease, but evil. Right? Cancer is an evil. God did not design this. There's a reason why it's there, but it's not God's design. Stop blaming God for the stuff that we've done to ourselves or that Satan has done to us. Right? So Jesus confronts this, heals this, and all of a sudden everyone around him starts blaming Jesus for it. Oh my God, he's a demon. He's healed that guy. It doesn't make any sense, but that was a reaction. So Jesus is becoming the scapegoat. If you think about it, if you had COVID right now, everyone would treat you like a leper. Imagine Jesus coming into a ward here and healing everyone of COVID. And then everyone calling him a demon for doing it instead of being grateful. But that's what happened. And that does happen. So the demons know he's the Son of God. And you'll hear that when their voices come, what have you got to do with the Son of God? Stop tormenting us. They're afraid of him, and they should be. Because they're cosmic beings. They know that their end is coming. He's the one who's going to deal with them decisively. Third person that speaks of Jesus as the Son of God. Peter, the one who evangelized Mark. Thanks be to God. There's a moment of grace, and he will say, I was waiting for one of you to realize who I was. You didn't figure this out on your own. My Father in heaven revealed this to you. You're going to be the leader of the church when I die. Right? That's the third one. You know the fourth one is? This is the one that would always get soldiers' attention. If you think about it, you think about a systemic killing of people. In other words, a system that kills people. So judges, politicians, laws, a citizenry. This afternoon I read an article about the guillotine. You know the guillotine in the French Revolution? People would come and watch that as a spectacle. I can't get my head wrapped around that. I don't even like watching horror movies. Like, even when they fake it, I don't need to see that kind of human suffering. I've seen it for real. We used to do that, right? So there's a systemic reality of Jesus' time was that they killed people they didn't agree with. And I would go out on a limb and say that it happens in many countries and many places in our world today. Then becomes a question is, who do you blame for killing Jesus Christ? Is it Pontius Pilate? We say that. Who crucified? We blame Pontius, right? Because he's the most powerful. But there's a whole lot of people connected to that, right? Herod's clan, the Pharisees. There's a whole bunch of people implicated in his death. And amongst other things, top on that list is the man who nailed him to the cross. Can you imagine? A man whose job it was, like the execution of the guillotine, he did this day in and day out. And according to Mark, this is what he says. This is magnificent part, chapter 15. Now, when the centurion who stood facing him, so chapter 13, verse 39 following. Now, when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way, he breathed his last. What does he say when he breathed his last? He says, "Forgive them, Father, for they don't know what they're doing," right? He said, "Truly, this man was God's son." Right? So imagine being the guy who killed Jesus Christ, looking up at God's son and saying, "Oh my God, what have I done? I'm the man who murdered Jesus Christ." And we might find that a great angst and despair. And I would say this as a veteran. The greatest thing to break a veteran's heart is the realization that he's done something wrong in war. And it happens, right? As a chaplain to soldiers, I went to great lengths to remind them of their ethical nature. We are not here to lose our humanity. We will be judged accountable before God for what we do here, so walk very carefully. We're not here to kill people, right? That may happen in this ugly business, and that's the way it is, but our job is to be more noble. right? I never ever wanted one of the many beautiful men and women I serve with to be that guy. But on the other hand, I do want to be that guy because that confession doesn't come from him. That means that in the moment, and that's the great hope. That's why we know Mark, for example, speaking to a very Roman community. If God can save the man who killed his son, God can save everyone. Right? Christianity doesn't have in it the notion of a vendetta. We're not here to get even with those who have done wrong. That's not the gospel of Mark. Despite all that suffering, all that hurt, all that hate, that's not the goal. So what this man echoes kind of reverberates through all of history, and his legend would have it. And you'll find this sometimes, that sometimes we think Mark himself may have been a soldier at one point. He may have been a centurion, right? And I suspect he knew these things. He knew these things intimately. So his conversion, like St. Paul's, which is really powerful, Mark's is nonetheless, right? Which again, why did he write the gospel? Because I think he knew Jesus Christ in a very personal way. So that ends our talk for tonight. Any thoughts, concerns? Anything you want to add? Any questions? Yeah, the homework this week for those of us who are online and those of us who are here, and it's a proposition, never an imposition, right? I'm not your grade 7 English teacher. I'm not going to mark you for this, but life will. The proposal is this. This is my what do they call it? Elevator pitch. Read the Gospel of Mark this week. It'll take you an hour and a half. Read it cover to cover. Sit down, make yourself comfortable, read the whole thing. Don't read it in parts. We can sit through a movie. We can sit through one of the greatest books ever written, right? If you can, read it with somebody else, someone you love. Share it with them. But better yet, or just as equally, take some time. It's a great Sunday afternoon. It's better than anything you're ever going to find on Netflix or Amazon. I can tell you that right now. Get to know the Jesus of Mark's gospel, and then we'll journey with Mark for the next year. Amen.